The howling winds of Montana Territory carried whispers of danger as Emma Turner clutched the crumpled letter to her chest, her trembling fingers leaving sweat marks on the paper that had promised a new life. The stagecoach rattled beneath her as it sped along the rugged trail toward Globe, the small mining town where her intended husband awaited. But Emma wasn't thinking about the blacksmith who had paid for her passage from Boston. She was thinking about the 3 riders who had been following the coach for the last hour, their silhouettes growing larger with each passing minute. "We've got trouble, folks," the driver shouted, cracking his whip over the team of horses. "Hold on tight." Emma's heart pounded against her ribs as she peered out the window. The year was 1878, and the West was still wild and untamed. She had left everything behind: her job as a seamstress, her tiny rented room, the graves of her parents, all for the promise of security with a man she had never met. Now, as gunshots rang out and the coach lurched violently, that dream seemed to be dissolving before her eyes. "Halt that coach or we'll shoot the horses," a gruff voice called from behind. The elderly couple sharing the coach with Emma exchanged terrified glances. The woman reached out and squeezed Emma's hand. "Those are the Carter brothers," the old man whispered. "They've been terrorizing coaches along this route for months." Emma felt her blood run cold. She had heard stories of the Carter gang even back in Boston, ruthless outlaws who left no witnesses. The stagecoach began to slow, and Emma knew she had seconds to make a decision that would determine her fate. As the coach rolled to a stop, she slipped the letter into her boot and glanced at the small leather satchel containing her meager belongings. There was nothing worth dying for in that bag. "When I say run, you run," the old man said to her, his eyes suddenly fierce despite his frail appearance. "My wife and I will create a distraction. You're young, you deserve a chance." "I can't leave you," Emma protested, but the old woman shook her head. "Child, we've lived our lives. Now go, and may God be with you." The coach door flew open, and a bearded man with a revolver pointed it inside. "Out, all of you, and hand over your valuables if you want to live." The old man suddenly lunged forward, knocking the outlaw off balance. "Run, girl," he shouted. Emma didn't hesitate. She leapt from the opposite side of the coach and sprinted toward a cluster of boulders, the sounds of shouting and gunfire erupting behind her. Tears streamed down her face as she ran, knowing the fate that likely awaited the kind elderly couple who had sacrificed themselves for her. The rough terrain tore at her dress and scraped her hands as she scrambled up a rocky slope. She had no plan, no destination except away from the outlaws. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she pushed forward, her lungs burning, her legs aching. After what felt like hours, Emma collapsed behind a large boulder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She strained to listen for pursuit, but heard only the whisper of wind through the sparse pine trees. The vastness of the Montana wilderness stretched out before her, beautiful, terrifying, and utterly indifferent to her plight. Night was falling, and with it came the bone-chilling cold of the high country. Emma huddled against the rock, wrapping her thin traveling cloak tightly around her shoulders. She was miles from Globe, with no food, no water, and no knowledge of how to survive in this harsh land. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Emma Turner did something she hadn't done since her mother died 2 years ago. She prayed. Miles away, at the edge of his property, Vincent Carson stood in his stirrups, squinting at the distant horizon. The cattle were settled for the night, but something had spooked his horses earlier, a feeling that had him riding the boundary of his ranch long after his foreman had returned to the main house. At 32, Vince had built his spread from nothing. 10 years of back-breaking work, smart cattle trading, and the occasional lucky hand at poker had transformed him from a penniless drifter into one of the most respected ranchers in the territory. The Triple C Ranch employed a dozen men and supplied beef to mining camps throughout Montana. Yet for all his success, Vince felt a hollowness that property and cattle couldn't fill. The ranch house he'd built 3 years ago, sturdy pine logs and a stone fireplace big enough to warm the whole main room, stood mostly empty. He'd added an extra bedroom, a larger kitchen, even a small sitting room where a lady might entertain guests. But the only woman who ever crossed his threshold was Mrs. Abernathy, who came twice a week to cook and clean. His foreman, Jake Billings, had often suggested Vince consider advertising for a mail-order bride, as several successful ranchers in the territory had done. Vince had always laughed off the suggestion. He wanted more than a business arrangement with a woman. He wanted what his parents had shared, a love that had sustained them through the hardships of frontier life, until fever took them both when Vince was 18. A flash of movement in the distance caught his eye. Vince reached for the spyglass he kept in his saddlebag and trained it on the ridge to the east. Something or someone was moving slowly along the line of rocks, silhouetted against the dying light. "What the devil?" he muttered, lowering the glass. The Triple C was 15 miles from the main road. Travelers rarely strayed this far from the trail, especially on foot. With the recent reports of stagecoach robberies, Vince wasn't taking chances. He checked his revolver, then nudged his horse forward, keeping to the tree line as he approached the ridge. As he drew closer, Vince could make out a slender figure stumbling along the rocky ground. Not the broad-shouldered silhouette of a man, but the unmistakable shape of a woman, her skirts catching on the brush as she moved with obvious exhaustion. Vince spurred his horse into a trot, caution giving way to concern. No woman should be out here alone, especially with night falling and the temperature dropping. As he approached, she seemed to sense his presence. She turned, and even in the dim light, he could see the terror on her face. Before he could call out a reassurance, she scrambled behind a boulder, disappearing from view. "Hello there," Vince called, keeping his voice gentle as he dismounted. "I mean you no harm, madam. Are you lost?" Silence greeted him. He tied his horse to a scrub pine and approached slowly, hands visible at his sides. "My name is Vincent Carson. I own the Triple C Ranch nearby. If you're in trouble, I can help you." A small voice, hoarse from thirst, finally responded. "How do I know you're not one of them?" "One of who, madam?" "The outlaws, the ones who attacked the stage to Globe." Vince felt his jaw tighten. "Another robbery." "I'm no outlaw, I'm a rancher, been in these parts for 10 years. He took off his hat, trying to appear less threatening. "There's a settlement of sorts at my ranch house. You'd be safe there, and we can notify the sheriff about the robbery." A long pause followed before a young woman emerged from behind the boulder. Her dress was torn and dirty, her hands scratched and bleeding. But it was her eyes that caught Vince's attention, green as spring grass, wide with fear but burning with determination. "The Carter brothers," she said, her voice stronger now. "They attacked our stage. An elderly couple helped me escape, but I fear they—" Her voice broke and she wrapped her arms around herself. "The Carters." Vince spat the name like a curse. The notorious gang had been a plague on the territory for over a year. "Madam, you're lucky to be alive. Let me take you somewhere safe." She hesitated, studying his face as if searching for any sign of deceit. Whatever she saw must have reassured her, for she nodded slowly. "My name is Emma Turner," she said. "I was coming to Globe to marry a man named Herbert Benson. He's a blacksmith there." Vince nodded. "I know Herb." "Decent man." He held out his hand to help her. "You're a good 15 miles off course, Miss Turner. You must have been walking for hours." Emma accepted his help, her small hand cold in his larger one. "I just ran. I didn't know where I was going." As she tried to take a step, her legs buckled beneath her. Vince caught her before she fell, supporting her slight weight easily. "You're exhausted. Let me help you onto my horse." Emma didn't protest as he lifted her into the saddle. She seemed to be at the end of her strength, swaying slightly as she gripped the pommel. Vince untied his canteen and passed it to her. "Small sips," he advised. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She nodded gratefully, taking careful sips of the lukewarm water. Vince gathered the reins and began leading the horse back toward the ranch, walking beside the animal so Emma wouldn't have to ride double with a stranger. "The ranch is about 2 miles from here," he said. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, can help get you cleaned up. Then tomorrow I'll take you into Globe, or if you prefer, send a message to Herb to come fetch you." Emma didn't immediately respond. When Vince glanced up at her, he saw she was looking over her shoulder, back toward the eastern ridge. "They won't find you at the Triple C," he assured her. "And if they try, they'll regret it." "I put those people in danger," she whispered. "The old couple on the stage, they sacrificed themselves for me. That was their choice, Miss Turner. Honor it by staying alive." She turned back to him, a tear trailing down her dirt-smudged cheek. "Yes." "You're right, Mr. Carson." "Vince," he corrected gently. "Vince," she repeated, and despite everything, he found himself appreciating the way his name sounded in her soft voice. They traveled in silence for a while, the only sounds the creaking of the saddle and the steady footfalls of the horse. The night had fully descended now, stars puncturing the vast blackness overhead. Vince kept a careful eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of trouble, but the land remained quiet. "I've never seen so many stars," Emma said suddenly, her voice filled with wonder despite her exhaustion. Vince looked up, trying to see the familiar sight through her eyes. "The city lights dim them back east. Out here, nothing gets between you and the heavens. It's beautiful, terrifying but beautiful. That's the West for you, Miss Turner, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure." The lights of the ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill. The main house stood sturdy and welcoming, with the bunkhouse, barn, and corrals spread out behind it. A lantern still burned on the porch, left lit for Vince's return. "Home," Vince said simply. As they approached, the front door opened and a stocky figure stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "That you, boss?" called Jake Billings, his voice carrying in the night air. "It's me, Jake. We have a guest. Trouble on the Eastern Trail." Jake lowered his rifle as they reached the yard. His weathered face registered surprise at the sight of Emma, but he quickly recovered, moving to help her down from the horse. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat respectfully. "Jake Billings, foreman of the Triple C." "Emma Turner," she replied, her legs unsteady as she stood on solid ground again. "Miss Turner escaped a stagecoach robbery," Vince explained. "The Carter gang. She needs food, rest, and medical attention." Jake's expression darkened at the mention of the Outlaws. "Those bastards begging your pardon, madam. They hit another stage last month near Clearwater Creek." "I'll stable your horse, boss," he added, taking the reins. "You get the lady inside." Vince nodded his thanks and gently guided Emma toward the house. As they stepped onto the porch, he felt her tense beside him. "I don't want to impose," she said hesitantly. "Perhaps there's a woman in your household who could. Mrs. Abernathy only comes in during the day," Vince explained. "But my foreman's wife, Sarah, lives in the small cabin just beyond the bunkhouse. I can send for her if it would make you more comfortable." Relief softened Emma's features. "Yes, please. I wouldn't want to compromise propriety." Despite everything she had endured, she was concerned about appearances. Vince found himself smiling at this glimpse of proper Eastern sensibilities. "Jake," he called, "ask Sarah to come up to the house, would you?" As Jake headed toward the cabin, Vince led Emma inside the ranch house. The main room was warm from the banked fire, simple but comfortable with its sturdy furniture and woven rugs. Emma's eyes moved over everything: the bookshelves filled with volumes, the landscape paintings on the walls, the polished dining table set for one. "You have a lovely home," she said, genuine appreciation in her voice. "Thank you. It's more house than I need, truth be told." Vince moved to stoke the fire, adding another log. "Please sit. You look about ready to collapse." Emma sank gratefully onto the sofa, her eyes already beginning to drift closed. Vince fetched a blanket from a chest and draped it over her shoulders just as a knock sounded at the door. Sarah Billings entered, her kind face flushed from her hurried walk up from the cabin. In her early 40s, with graying brown hair and capable hands, she took in the situation at a glance. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, moving immediately to Emma's side. "Jake told me what happened. Let's get you cleaned up and into some fresh clothes." With gentle efficiency, Sarah helped Emma to her feet and guided her toward the back of the house where Vince's unused guest room waited. At the doorway, Emma paused and looked back at Vince. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Something in her grateful gaze stirred a protective instinct in Vince that went beyond basic human decency. "You're safe now, Miss Turner. Get some rest." After they disappeared down the hallway, Vince poured himself a small whiskey and sat heavily in his armchair. The Carter gang was becoming bolder, and if they discovered they'd missed a witness, they might come looking for Emma. Globe wasn't far enough away to ensure her safety, especially if word got around about a new bride arriving for the blacksmith. Vince swirled the amber liquid in his glass, considering options. The territorial marshal was supposedly hunting the Carters, but the last anyone had heard, he was up near Helena, at least 4 days' ride away. The sheriff in Globe was getting on in years and had a fondness for the bottle that made him less than reliable. Sarah reappeared some time later, carrying Emma's torn and dirty dress. "She's bathed and sleeping now, poor thing," she reported. "I gave her one of my night dresses and a clean set of clothes for tomorrow. She's exhausted but doesn't seem seriously hurt, just scrapes and bruises." "Thank you, Sarah. Will you stay with her tonight?" "Of course. I've already sent Jake to bring my overnight things." She hesitated, her motherly face concerned. "Vince, that girl told me she was coming to marry Herbert Benson." Vince nodded. "That's what she told me too." "Well, I don't like to gossip, but Martha from the general store was saying just last week that Herb's taken up with the widow Johnson. Been seen calling on her regular these past 2 months. Vince frowned. "You think he's abandoned his arrangement with Miss Turner?" It wouldn't be the first time a man changed his mind about a mail-order bride before she arrived. Sarah shook her head disapprovingly. "That poor girl traveled all this way. What's she to do now?" It was a good question, and one that troubled Vince as he bid Sarah good night and headed to his own bedroom. He stretched out on his bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep elusive despite the long day. Emma Turner's face kept appearing in his mind, her determined green eyes, the grateful smile she'd given him, the courage it must have taken to flee into the wilderness rather than face the outlaws. She didn't strike him as the type to give up easily, mail-order bride or not. But if Herbert Benson had indeed found another wife, Emma would be stranded in Globe with no prospects and no protection. And if the Carter gang learned of her survival and came looking for the witness who could identify them. Vince rolled onto his side, his decision made. Tomorrow he would ride into Globe, find out about Herb's situation, and warn the sheriff about the stagecoach robbery. But regardless of what he discovered, he wouldn't leave Emma Turner unprotected. She had survived too much already to face new dangers alone. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Triple C ranch. Vince had been up since before first light, checking on the cattle with his men and giving instructions for the day's work. As he returned to the main house for breakfast, he saw Emma standing on the porch, wrapped in a shawl that must have belonged to Sarah. In the morning light, with her copper-red hair neatly braided and wearing Sarah's simple blue dress, she looked transformed from the terrified, bedraggled woman he had found on the ridge. Still pale and too thin, but composed and alert, taking in the ranch with obvious interest. "Good morning, Miss Turner," he called as he approached. "I trust you slept well." She turned at the sound of his voice, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. "Better than I expected, Mr. Carson. Vince," she corrected herself. "Your guest room is more comfortable than my lodgings in Boston were. I'm glad to hear it." He joined her on the porch, removing his hat. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Sore," she admitted, "but alive, thanks to you. Mrs. Billings has been very kind. Sarah's the heart of this place. Don't know what we'd do without her." Emma nodded, then looked out over the ranch again. "You've built something impressive here. How long have you had the Triple C?" 10 years, though it didn't look like much when I started. Just a run-down cabin and 50 acres. The rest came bit by bit." Vince found himself wanting to show her the improvements he'd made, the plans he had for expansion. He pushed the impulse aside. "Miss Turner, Emma, please." "Emma, I need to ride into Globe today to speak with the sheriff about the robbery. I thought you might want to come along, see about your situation with Herbert Benson." A shadow crossed her face. "Yes, of course. I should honor my commitment." There was something in her tone that made Vince wonder if her heart was truly in the arrangement, not that it was any of his business. "There's something you should know," he said carefully. "It may be nothing, but Sarah mentioned hearing that Herb has been calling on a widow in town these past months." Emma's eyebrows rose, but she didn't look particularly distressed. "I see. Well, that would explain why he never replied to my last 2 letters." She twisted her hands together briefly before straightening her shoulders. "Nevertheless, I should speak with him. At the very least, he paid for my passage west. I owe him the courtesy of a conversation." "Of course." Vince was impressed by her practical approach. Many women would have dissolved into tears at the news their intended might have found someone else. "We'll leave after breakfast if that suits you." "That would be fine. Thank you." As they turned to enter the house, the sound of approaching horses made them both pause. 3 riders were coming up the long drive from the main road, moving at an unhurried pace. "Are you expecting visitors?" Emma asked, a new tension in her voice. "No." Vince reached instinctively for the revolver at his hip. "Stay here." He moved down the porch steps into the yard, positioning himself between Emma and the approaching riders. Jake emerged from the barn. A Winchester rifle in his hands, and 2 other ranch hands appeared from the bunkhouse, alert to the potential trouble. As the riders drew closer, Vince relaxed slightly. He recognized the man in the lead, Sheriff Thomas Fletcher from Globe, his silver star catching the morning sun. The 2 men with him were deputies Vince had seen in town. "Morning, Sheriff," Vince called as the trio reined in their horses. "What brings you out to the Triple C so early?" Fletcher, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a drooping gray mustache, nodded in greeting. "Carson, got word about a stagecoach robbery yesterday afternoon on the eastern route. 3 passengers killed, driver 2, Carter gang by all accounts." Vince heard Emma's sharp intake of breath behind him. "3 passengers?" she asked, moving forward to stand beside him. "An elderly couple and who else?" The sheriff frowned at her. "And you are Miss—" "This is Emma Turner," Vince explained. "She was on that stage but managed to escape during the robbery. I found her on my property last night." Fletcher's bushy eyebrows shot up. "That's so. Well, miss, to answer your question, the victims were an elderly couple named Howard and Martha Jenkins, and a traveling salesman. William somebody or other didn't have much identification on him. Emma closed her eyes briefly. The Jenkins, they helped me escape, created a distraction so I could run. Brave folks, Fletcher said, removing his hat respectfully. Miss, I'd like to hear everything you saw. You're the only witness we've got, of course. Emma's voice was steady despite the grief evident on her face. Though I didn't see much of the actual robbery, I ran when Mr. Jenkins created the diversion. Still, anything you can tell us would help. Been chasing these Carters for months with no luck. Vince gestured toward the house. Why don't we all go inside? Sarah's just about got breakfast ready, and you men look like you could use some coffee. Over plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, Emma recounted her experience, the pursuit of the stagecoach, the demand to stop, Mr. Jenkins's brave distraction, and her flight into the wilderness. She described the men she had seen as best she could, though she admitted to being too frightened to notice many details. There were 3 of them that I saw, she concluded. The one who opened the coach door had a dark beard and a scar across his left cheek. He seemed to be in charge. Fletcher nodded grimly. That'd be Jeremiah Carter, the oldest brother, mean as a rattlesnake with twice the venom. The other 2 were likely Luke and Elias, his brothers. Did they get much in the robbery? Vince asked. About $200 from the strongbox, plus whatever the passengers were carrying. The sheriff shook his head. Not worth 4 lives, that's for damn sure. Beggin' your pardon, miss. What happens now? Emma asked. I'll send telegrams to marshals in the territory. Let them know we've got a witness. Fletcher turned his weathered face toward Vince. In the meantime, might be safer for the lady to stay out of sight. If the Carters realized there was a 4th passenger who got away, they might come looking. Vince had been thinking the same thing. She's welcome to stay at the CCC as long as needed. That's kind, but I was meant to meet my fiancé in Globe, Emma protested. Mr. Herbert Benson is expecting me. An uncomfortable look passed over Fletcher's face. Ah, well, about that, miss. Herbert Benson got married 3 weeks ago to Margaret Johnson, widow with 2 young uns whose husband died in a mine collapse last year. Though Vince had suspected as much from Sarah's gossip, the confirmation still made him angry on Emma's behalf. He couldn't have sent word. Let her know before she traveled all this way. Emma sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. I see, she said quietly. Well, that changes things. If it's any consolation, miss, I don't think he meant to be dishonorable, Fletcher said awkwardly. Margaret's boy took sick with pneumonia this winter. Herb helped care for the family, and one thing led to another. It's all right, Sheriff. Mr. Benson and I had never met. Our arrangement was a practical one, not a romance. Emma's voice was composed, but Vince could see the slight tremble in her hands. However, this does leave me in a difficult position. You can stay at the CCC until things are sorted, Vince repeated firmly. The guest room is yours for as long as you need it. Sarah, who had been listening quietly as she served the meal, spoke up. It would be nice to have another woman around the place, and I could use help with the cooking and cleaning if you're willing, Emma. My arthritis has been acting up something fierce this spring. Vince shot Sarah a grateful look. Offering Emma employment would preserve her dignity while giving her a legitimate reason to stay under his protection. I'd be happy to help, Emma said, relief evident in her voice. I'm a fair cook, and I was a seamstress in Boston, so I'm handy with a needle. Then it's settled, Vince declared, ignoring the knowing look Jake gave him across the table. At least until the Carter gang is captured and it's safe for you to travel. Sheriff Fletcher finished his coffee and rose to his feet. Speaking of which, we best be on our way. Got to organize a search party for those outlaws. They can't have gotten far. As the lawman prepared to leave, Fletcher pulled Vince aside on the porch. "Keep a close eye out, Carson. The Carters are desperate men. If they learn there's a witness who could identify them, they won't hesitate to silence her." Vince's jaw tightened. "They'll have to go through me first." The older man studied him thoughtfully. "You always were a good man in a fight. Just make sure you know what you're fighting for." He glanced toward the house where Emma stood with Sarah, then back at Vince with a knowing expression. "I'm fighting for justice," Vince replied evenly. "And for the safety of a woman who's been through enough already, if you say so." Fletcher settled his hat on his head. "I'll send word when we know anything about the Carters' whereabouts. Until then, watch your back." After the sheriff and his deputies rode away, Vince found Emma in the kitchen, already helping Sarah with the breakfast dishes despite her ordeal. "You don't have to start work right away," he said. "You should rest today." Emma shook her head. "I've imposed on your hospitality enough. Besides, keeping busy helps me not to think about." She trailed off, but Vince understood. The Jenkins, the robbery, her abandoned future in Globe, all of it would be overwhelming if dwelled upon. "At least take it easy," he insisted. "Sarah, don't let her overdo it." The older woman smiled. "Don't worry, boss. I'll take good care of our new helper." Over the next few days, Emma quickly found her place in the rhythm of ranch life. Each morning she rose early to help Sarah prepare breakfast for Vince and the ranch hands. During the day, she assisted with household chores, mending clothes, and even began working on curtains for the bare windows in the sitting room. In the evenings, after the men had been fed and the kitchen cleaned, she often sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in spectacular hues. Vince found himself looking forward to those twilight moments when he would join her, both of them sipping coffee and talking about the day. He learned that she was 23, orphaned 2 years earlier when influenza took both her parents within a week of each other. With no siblings or close relatives to help, she had supported herself as a seamstress until the rising costs of city living made accepting Herbert Benson's proposal seem like her best option. "I'd seen what happened to women who couldn't support themselves in Boston," she explained on the third evening. "The workhouses, the brothels. I didn't want that future. Herbert seemed kind in his letters, steady. I thought I could build a life with him, even without love. And now?" Vince asked, watching her profile in the fading light. She turned to him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Now I'm beginning to think fate had other plans for me. As terrible as the robbery was, it led me here instead of to a man who had already given his heart to someone else." Something warm unfurled in Vince's chest at her words. Before he could respond, however, Jake rode into the yard at a gallop. "Riders coming, boss," he called, dismounting quickly. 6 of them moving fast from the east. Vince was on his feet immediately. "Get the men. Rifles ready." As Jake hurried to alert the other ranch hands, Vince turned to Emma. "Go inside and stay away from the windows." The fear was back in her eyes, but she nodded resolutely. "Be careful," she said, touching his arm briefly before hurrying into the house. Vince gathered his men in the yard, all of them armed and positioned strategically around the buildings. As the riders came into view, Vince felt a surge of relief it wasn't the Carter gang, but a group of cowboys from the neighboring Rocking D Ranch. Their leader, Daniel Prescott, raised a hand in greeting as they approached. "Carson, don't shoot, it's just us." Vince signaled his men to lower their weapons. "Bit late for a social call, isn't it, Prescott?" "Not social. Warning." Daniel dismounted, his expression grim. "The Carter gang hit Pete Simmons' place this afternoon, burned his barn, stole his horses, shot Pete when he tried to stop them." "Is he alive?" "Barely. Doc's with him now." Daniel removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. Thing is, they were asking questions before they started shooting. Wanted to know if Pete had seen a woman, red-haired, traveling alone. Vince felt his blood run cold. They're looking for a witness. That's what we figured. Sheriff Fletcher sent riders to all the ranches in the area to warn folks. The Carters were headed south when they left Pete's place, but that doesn't mean much. They could circle back. I appreciate the warning, Vince said, his mind already working through the implications. You men want to water your horses before you head back. As the rocking Cowboys refreshed themselves and their mounts, Vince went inside to find Emma. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Sarah, both women tense with worry. It's not the Carters, he assured them immediately. Neighbors with a warning, but it's not good news. He explained about Pete Simmons and the Outlaws' questions. They know I survived, Emma whispered, her face pale. How? Someone might have found tracks, or maybe they counted the bodies and realized one passenger was missing. Vince sat down across from her. Either way, they're looking for you. I've put all of you in danger. Emma's voice shook slightly. Perhaps I should leave, draw them away from the ranch. Absolutely not, Vince said firmly. That's exactly what they want. You'd be dead before you made it 5 miles. Sarah reached over to pat Emma's hand. He's right, dear. The Triple C is the safest place for you right now. Vince and the boys won't let those outlaws get near you. Emma didn't look convinced, but she nodded. What do we do now? We prepare, Vince said grimly, and we send for help. Jake's riding to Globe tonight to update Sheriff Fletcher and send telegrams to the federal marshals. In the meantime, we'll fortify the ranch. The Carters aren't the only ones who can plan an ambush. For the next 2 days, the Triple C operated in a state of heightened vigilance. Vince doubled the night watch and sent riders out in pairs to check the boundaries of the property. The ranch hands moved their belongings into the main house, turning the living room into an impromptu barracks that would be easier to defend than the scattered bunkhouse. Windows were reinforced, ammunition counted and distributed, and escape routes planned through it all. Emma worked alongside Sarah, preparing meals for the men, helping to organize supplies, and even assisting with loading cartridges. Her initial fear had given way to a quiet determination that impressed Vince more with each passing day. On the evening of the second day, as Vince checked the rifle placements near the barn, he found Emma standing alone by the corral, watching the sunset. You shouldn't be out here by yourself, he said, coming to stand beside her. I needed some air. The house feels crowded. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. This is all my fault. If I had just stayed on that stagecoach, you'd be dead, Vince interrupted. Like the Jenkins and that salesman. But your ranch wouldn't be preparing for a siege. Your men wouldn't be risking their lives. Emma. Vince gently turned her to face him. None of this is your fault. The Carters made their choice when they decided to rob that stage and kill those people. My men and I are choosing to stand against them because it's the right thing to do. Is that the only reason? She asked softly, her green eyes searching his face. The question caught him off guard. Vince had been trying not to examine his feelings too closely, the protectiveness that went beyond duty, the way his thoughts constantly returned to her throughout the day, the warmth that flooded him when she smiled. It wasn't the time for such considerations, not with danger approaching. But standing there in the golden light of sunset, with Emma looking up at him with a vulnerability that matched his own unspoken feelings, Vince couldn't lie. No, he admitted. It's not the only reason. Something shifted in her expression, fear giving way to a tentative hope. Vince. The sound of a rifle shot cracked through the evening air, followed instantly by a shout from the watchtower. Riders coming, at least a dozen. Vince grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the main house. Inside now. As they ran, More shots rang out, and Vince saw his men rushing to their defensive positions. They had barely reached the porch when a volley of gunfire erupted from the tree line to the east. "Get down!" Vince pushed Emma through the door, shielding her with his body as bullets splintered the wood around them. Once inside, he barred the door and guided her to the center of the house, where Sarah and two of the younger ranch hands were already crouching. "Stay here," he ordered. "Don't move unless the house is breached." Emma clutched his arm. "Be careful." There was no time for more words. Vince grabbed his Winchester from the rack by the door and moved to a window, peering cautiously through a gap in the shutters. At least 15 riders were spread out along the eastern edge of the property. Not just the Carter brothers, but a collection of hard cases they must have recruited. They were using the trees for cover, as they exchanged fire with the Triple C men positioned in the barn and corrals. "They've got us outnumbered," Jake reported, joining Vince at another window. "But we've got better positions. They can't approach the house without crossing open ground." "Let's hope they realize that before anyone gets killed," Vince muttered, sighting down his rifle at a figure moving between trees. He fired, and the man ducked back into cover. For nearly an hour, the gunfight continued as a stalemate, neither side able to gain an advantage. Darkness had fallen completely, making it harder to spot targets when a new sound cut through the gunfire, the crack and roar of flames. "They've fired the north corral," someone shouted from outside. Vince cursed. The dry timber would burn quickly, and if the wind shifted, the fire could spread to the barn or even the house. "Jake, take 4 men and deal with that fire. The rest of us will provide covering fire." As Jake gathered his team, a voice boomed out from the darkness. "Carson, send out the woman and we'll leave your ranch standing. Keep her and we'll burn everything you own to the ground." Jeremiah Carter. Vince had never met the outlaw, but he recognized the arrogant authority in the voice. "You're not getting the woman, Carter," Vince shouted back. "And you're not burning my ranch. The sheriff knows you're here. Territorial marshals are on their way." A laugh floated back through the darkness. "The sheriff's busy with a fire in town. Won't be here to help you. You've got 5 minutes to send her out or the main house burns next." Vince turned to find Emma standing behind him, her face pale but resolved in the lamplight. "I should go," she said quietly. "They'll kill all of you otherwise." "No," the word came out as a growl. "That's not happening. Vince, be reasonable. I can't let people die for me again." The Jenkins were enough. "They'll kill you, Emma." Vince gripped her shoulders gently. "I won't let that happen. I can't." The intensity in his voice made her eyes widen. Before she could respond, Jake burst back into the house. "Boss, they're moving around to the west side. Trying to flank us while we deal with the fire." Vince released Emma reluctantly. "Get back to the center room," he told her. "Jake, tell the men on the east side to hold position. I'll take the rest to the west." The next hour was chaos. The Carter's men pressed their attack from both sides while the fire in the north corral blazed higher, casting an eerie orange glow over the battlefield. 2 of Vince's men were wounded, though not critically, and they'd confirmed at least 3 of the attackers down. Vince was reloading his rifle when a crash and scream came from the back of the house. He ran toward the sound, heart pounding, to find the window of the kitchen smashed in. Sarah lay on the floor, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead, and the back door stood open. "They took her." Sarah gasped. 2 men came through the window. I tried to stop them, but they hit me. They took Emma." Cold fear gripped Vince's heart. "Which way? Toward the creek, I think." Vince didn't hesitate. "Jake," he shouted. "The Carters have Emma. They went toward the creek. Hold the house." Without waiting for a response, Vince slipped out the back door and into the darkness, staying low as he moved away from the firelight. The creek ran along the southern edge of the ranch property, through a small wooded area that would provide cover for an escape. As he neared the trees, Vince heard voices, angry, urgent commands, and a woman's defiant responses. Emma wasn't going quietly. Moving carefully from tree to tree, Vince approached the sound. In a small clearing by the creek, 3 men stood around Emma. 2 held her arms, while the third, a tall man with a dark beard and the distinctive scar Emma had described, paced in front of her. "You should have died on that stagecoach," Jeremiah Carter was saying. "Now you've caused us all this trouble." "The trouble is your own making," Emma replied, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "You chose to rob that stage. You chose to murder those people." Carter laughed coldly. "Got spirit, don't you? Won't matter soon. Once we're done with you, no one will ever find your body." "I wouldn't be so sure about that." Vince stepped into the clearing, his revolver aimed squarely at Jeremiah Carter's chest. All 3 outlaws turned, reaching for their guns, but Vince's voice stopped them. "Touch those weapons and you die first, Carter. Your men are losing the fight at the ranch. Sheriff's probably already on his way. It's over." Carter's face twisted with rage. "It's not over until I say it is. You're 1 man against 3, and we've got your woman." "Let her go," Vince said evenly, though inside he was calculating distances and angles, trying to figure out how to get Emma clear before bullets started flying. "Or what? You'll shoot us all," Carter sneered. "Not even you are that fast." "Maybe not, but I'll get at least 2 of you." "Want to gamble on which 2? Vince took a deliberate step forward. "And the last thing you'll ever see is me putting a bullet between your eyes." The momentary uncertainty in Carter's expression told Vince his bluff was working, but it wouldn't last long. He needed to get Emma away from the outlaws. "Here's what's going to happen," Vince continued. "You're going to let Miss Turner go. Then you 3 are going to mount up and ride out of here. I don't care where you go as long as it's far from my ranch." "And why would we do that?" Carter demanded. "Because it's your only chance to live through the night." Vince's voice was cold. "I'll die before they touch you, Emma," he added, his eyes meeting hers. "But I promise, they'll die first." Something passed between them in that moment, understanding, trust, perhaps even something deeper. Emma gave an almost imperceptible nod. In the next instant, she drove her elbow hard into the stomach of the man on her right, then stomped on the foot of the one on her left. As they reflexively loosened their grip, she tore free and threw herself to the ground. Vince fired twice in rapid succession. The first outlaw fell, clutching his chest. The second staggered back, his gun only half drawn. Carter managed to get a shot off, but his aim was rushed, the bullet whistling past Vince's ear. Before Carter could fire again, Vince lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The outlaw was strong and desperate, clawing for Vince's gun, landing a solid punch to his jaw. They rolled in the dirt, neither able to get the upper hand until Carter's fingers found a rock. He swung it at Vince's head, but Vince jerked back just in time, the stone grazing his temple instead of crushing his skull. The momentary disorientation was enough for Carter to break free and scramble toward his fallen gun. Vince launched himself after the outlaw, grabbing his ankle, pulling him back. Carter kicked out, his boot connecting with Vince's shoulder, but Vince didn't let go. With a roar of effort, Vince yanked hard, pulling Carter off balance. As the outlaw fell, Vince was on him, pinning him down, landing a solid punch that snapped Carter's head back. Another blow, and Carter went limp beneath him. Breathing hard, Vince pushed himself to his feet, searching for Emma. She stood a few yards away, Carter's fallen revolver clutched in her trembling hands, pointed steadily at the third outlaw who was frozen in place, his own weapon half raised. "I suggest you drop that," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I've never shot a man before, but I'm quite motivated to learn." The outlaw looked from Emma to Vince, then at his unconscious leader and slowly lowered his gun. "Wise decision," Vince said, moving to Emma's side. He gently took the revolver from her hands. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but Vince could see she was fighting to maintain her composure. Her hands were shaking, and beneath the brave front, her eyes were wide with the aftermath of terror. "It's over," he assured her, keeping his gun trained on the remaining outlaw. "You're safe now." The sound of approaching horses made them both tense, but the call that came through the trees was welcome. "Vince." "Where are you?" "Over here, Jake, by the creek." "We've got Carter." Minutes later, Jake and 3 of the ranch hands burst into the clearing, rifles ready. "The rest of them are running," Jake reported. "Saw them high-tailing it east. Sheriff and his men just rode in from town. They're rounding up the stragglers." "Good. Help me secure these 2. Vince nodded toward Carter and the remaining outlaw. "This one needs medical attention first," he added, indicating the man Emma had shot, who was still breathing but unconscious. As the ranch hands took charge of the outlaws, Vince turned to Emma. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline was fading and she swayed slightly on her feet. "Let's get you back to the house," he said softly, putting an arm around her waist to steady her. She leaned into him, no longer trying to maintain her brave facade. "I thought they were going to kill me, and then you came, just like you promised." "I'll always come for you," Vince said, the words emerging before he could consider them. But as Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something warmer, he knew they were true. They walked slowly back toward the ranch, the glow from the dying corral fire lighting their way. The night's battle had left its mark on the Triple C damaged buildings, injured men, the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder hanging in the air. But the ranch still stood, and more importantly, so did the people who made it home. Sheriff Fletcher met them in the yard, his expression shifting from relief to concern when he saw their condition. "Miss Turner, thank God you're alive. We got word of the attack and came as fast as we could." He looked at Vince, taking in his bloodied face and torn clothing. "You look like hell, Carson." "Feel about the same," Vince admitted, "but we got Carter, his brothers too. Luke's dead. Elias is wounded, but he'll live to hang." Fletcher glanced toward the creek. "Jeremiah." "Unconscious but alive. Jake's bringing him in." The sheriff nodded with satisfaction. "That's the end of the Carter gang then. Been a long time coming." He turned back to Emma. "Miss, I'll need your statement about the stagecoach robbery and tonight's events, but it can wait until morning." "Thank you, Sheriff," Emma said wearily. "I'd appreciate that." As Fletcher moved off to help his deputies with the captured outlaws, Vince guided Emma toward the house. Sarah met them at the door, a bandage around her head but otherwise appearing unharmed. "Oh, thank the Lord," she exclaimed, pulling Emma into a fierce hug. "When those men took you, I thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm all right, Sarah," Emma assured her. "Thanks to Vince." Sarah turned her attention to Vince, clucking over his injuries. "Sit down, both of you. Let me tend those cuts before they fester." For the next hour, the ranch house was a flurry of activity as the wounded were treated, statements taken, and prisoners secured for transport to Globe in the morning. Through it all, Vince hardly let Emma out of his sight, as if afraid she might disappear if he looked away too long. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the ranch grew quiet. The sheriff and his men had established a temporary camp in the yard to guard the prisoners. The wounded ranch hands had been tended to and were resting comfortably. Sarah had finally been convinced to get some sleep after extracting promises from both Vince and Emma that they would do the same. Instead, they found themselves sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunrise paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink. Emma had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and Vince had cleaned up somewhat, though a dark bruise was forming along his jaw where Carter had struck him. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly, looking out over the landscape. "After everything that happened last night, the world just goes on. The sun rises, the birds sing." Vince nodded. "That's ranch life for you. Nature doesn't much care about human troubles. I think I like that." She turned to look at him, her face serious. "Vince, what happens now?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. The immediate danger was past. The Carters would face justice, and Emma was no longer in peril. But what did that mean for her future? For his? "That depends," he said carefully. "What do you want to happen?" Emma was quiet for a moment, considering. "When I left Boston, I thought I knew what my life would be. A marriage of convenience, a small house in Globe, security if not passion. But now—" "Now," Vince prompted when she hesitated. "Now I don't think I could settle for just security anymore." Her eyes met his, direct and honest. "These past days have shown me what courage feels like, what it means to be part of something worth fighting for, worth dying for even." Vince's heart quickened at her words. "The Triple C could use a woman like you," he said, then immediately regretted the inadequacy of the statement. "What I mean is, I know what you mean." A small smile curved her lips. "But I wouldn't stay just for the ranch, Vince." The honesty in her voice gave him courage. "When I found you on that ridge, I thought I was just helping someone in trouble. I never expected—" He took a breath, trying to find the right words. "I never expected you, Emma. Your courage, your kindness, the way you fit here like you've always belonged. And last night when you came for me, when you said you'd die before they touched me, I meant it," Vince said simply. "Every word." Emma's hand found his, her fingers cool against his palm. "I know, that's when I realized." "Realized what?" "That I'd found something I wasn't even looking for. Something Herbert Benson could never have given me, even if he'd honored our arrangement." Vince turned his hand to clasp hers properly. "I'm not good with fancy words, Emma, but I know that I want you to stay. Not as my housekeeper or Sarah's helper. Not as a mail-order bride fulfilling a contract, but as—" "As what?" she whispered, though her eyes told him she already knew the answer. "As my wife, if you'll have me." The words came out in a rush, surprising even himself with their certainty. "I know it's sudden. We've known each other barely a week, but sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of time to be sure. Sometimes you just know." A tear slipped down Emma's cheek, but she was smiling. "I left Boston looking for security. I never dreamed I'd find love instead. Is that a yes?" Vince asked, hardly daring to believe. In answer, Emma leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a gentle kiss, hesitant at first, then growing in confidence as Vince responded, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. When they finally broke apart, Emma was flushed, her green eyes bright. "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." The sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains now, casting a golden light over the Triple C ranch. In the yard, the ranch hands were beginning to stir, and from the kitchen came the sound of Sarah starting breakfast. Life was continuing just as Emma had observed. But for Vince and Emma, sitting hand in hand on the porch steps, something new was beginning. A love born in danger, tested by fire, and promising a future neither had imagined just days before. "I should warn you," Vince said with a smile, "ranch life isn't easy. Winters are harsh, work never ends, and the nearest town is 15 miles away." Emma squeezed his hand. "After everything we've faced, that hardly seems like a challenge. Besides," she added with a teasing glint in her eye, "I've heard the ranch owner is a good man in a fight." "The best," Vince agreed, pulling her close against his side as they watched the new day unfold over the land that would be their home. 6 months later, as winter settled over Montana territory, the Triple C Ranch hosted a celebration unlike any it had seen before. The main house, expanded over the autumn with a new wing and a larger kitchen, was filled with neighbors, friends, and the entire ranch staff, all gathered to celebrate the marriage of Vincent Carson and Emma Turner. The ceremony itself had been simple, performed by the circuit preacher in the main room before a roaring fire. Emma wore a dress of deep blue velvet that she had sewn herself, with help from Sarah. Vince, uncomfortable in his best suit but handsome nonetheless, had stumbled over his vows but spoken them with such sincerity that there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Now, as fiddles played and the celebration continued around them, the newly married couple stood on the porch, taking a moment of quiet amidst the festivities. "Happy, Mrs. Carson?" Vince asked, his arm around her waist. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible." The Triple C had flourished in the months since the Carter gang's defeat. With the Outlaws gone, the territory was safer. Trade increased, and the ranch's reputation grew. Emma had proven herself not just a capable homemaker, but a shrewd business partner. Her education helping with the accounts and correspondence that Vince had always neglected. Sheriff Fletcher, standing nearby with a glass of whiskey, raised it in a silent toast to the couple. He had become a regular visitor to the ranch, keeping them updated on the fate of the Carter brothers. Jeremiah and Elias had been tried and sentenced to hang, though appeals had delayed the execution. Justice was slow, but it was coming. "I got a letter from Martha Jenkins' sister last week," Emma said. "She wanted to thank us for making sure the Carters faced justice, said it gave her some peace." Vince nodded solemnly. "The Jenkins saved your life." "In a way, they gave us this." He gestured to the ranch, the celebration, their linked hands with matching gold bands. "I know, I think of them often." Emma was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "But tonight isn't for sadness. Tonight is for celebrating new beginnings." "Speaking of new beginnings," Vince said, his voice dropping lower just for her. "Sarah seems convinced we'll be needing that extra bedroom we built sooner rather than later. Says she can tell by the way you've been glowing lately." Emma blushed, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. "Sarah notices everything, doesn't she? I was waiting for the right moment to tell you." Vince's eyes widened. "You mean, in the spring?" Emma confirmed, her smile radiant. "Our first child will arrive with the new calves." For a moment, Vince couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotions he had never expected to feel. When he had found Emma Turner on that rocky ridge, terrified and alone, he could never have imagined the joy she would bring into his life. "I love you," he said finally, the words simple but filled with all he couldn't express. Emma reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar that had formed where Carter's rock had struck him, a permanent reminder of that night and all it had cost, all it had given them. "And I love you, Vincent Carson, from now until forever." As they sealed their promise with a kiss, snow began to fall gently around them, dusting the Triple C ranch in a blanket of white, a clean slate, a fresh beginning. A future full of possibilities neither had dared to dream of before finding each other on the wild Montana frontier.